The things that I do for my health, I find myself being more energized, more lucid and aware. My cognition is better than ever. My sleep is better than ever. I feel better today at nearly 40 years old than I did in my teens and in my 20s and early 30s.
Hi, I'm Matt Delaney, and I'm the Director of Programming and Innovation at Equinox. I'm sitting down with Chris Mirabile, CEO and co-founder of Novos Labs. After a nearly fatal health scare at an early age, Chris is motivated to pursue a life of health and wellness, dedicating his life's work to longevity research to maximize health, lifespan, and quality of life, leading him to found the nutraceutical brand Novos Labs. While much remains to be discovered in the world of longevity, Chris aims to share what he and researchers have learned in the past 10 plus years so everyone can lead a richer, longer life. So Chris, you do have a pretty compelling story of how you arrived at this place in your pursuit of longevity. So why don't you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So I was always interested in health. Ever since I was 12 years old, I picked up an issue of Men's Health magazine, and I was inspired by the people in that magazine. And so I started exercising, weightlifting. I was watching my diet, and I was consistent with this every single day for years until I was 15 years old. I was in New York City for a school trip, and at the Federal Reserve Bank, I was listening to a speech. I suddenly felt dizzy and nauseous. And next thing I knew, I woke up with blood all over my shirt. I had a seizure, and I severed my tongue, and I was bleeding all over myself. They rushed me to NYU Medical Center, and they gave me a CAT scan, and they found that I had a large mass above my left ear. So it turned out it was a brain tumor. They had to do emergency surgery. And fortunately, I'm here today living to tell the story. But going through that experience really evolved my interest in health from one that was admittedly purely superficial. It was about athletic performance and being attractive to one that was more biologically driven. It was, I want to avoid illness. Laying in the hospital bed and not knowing if I was going to survive after the brain surgery was really set things in context, really gave me perspective. And I had existential questions at that point. It really, it shifted my direction in my life in many ways in terms of becoming an entrepreneur and so on and so forth. But it planted that seed in my mind of wanting to make sure what I'm doing for my health is not only good for me today, but it's good for me tomorrow in years to come. And so about 7 years ago or so, when I became aware of longevity medicine and all of the research that was being done in the space by prestigious scientists and institutions, that was a trigger for me. It was very clear that was aligned with my 16-year-old self and the vision of what I wanted my health practices to bring me. That's essentially why I've gone down this path.
I mean, it's a pretty incredible way to arrive at your passion in life's work. 16 is kind of young, and I know for most people, their long-term implications on health is probably not something that they're thinking about. But is there an age that's too young to start thinking about a more long-term aspect to health?
No, there's no age that is too young. You're technically aging from the moment you're born. Some scientists would say that you're even aging while you're a fetus, while other scientists would say that maybe you start aging when you hit puberty. It's contested, but the point is that there's never a time that is too early for you to live a healthy life that is mindful of your future. That comes down to things like diet, activity, rest and sleep, psychology, and even supplementation. And the earlier you start, just like exercise or eating healthy, the better it is for you in the long term. Now, you're going to probably notice more pronounced changes if you go from an unhealthy life and you're 60 years old to a very healthy longevity focused lifestyle. But you can get started as early as you'd be willing to.
Via your website, you've reduced your biological age by 13.6 years, I think the number was. So when it comes to longevity, what does that word mean to you?
So longevity encompasses two concepts. It's essentially how long you live and how healthy you live. So ideally, you are in your prime state, feeling as optimized from a physical and health perspective as possible for as long as possible. So extending your lifespan to live as long as you can, but being healthy in the process, extending your health span as long as possible as well.
Got it. So you mentioned the idea of health span and lifespan. I feel like sometimes those words get thrown around a little bit synonymously. Can you explain the difference between the two of them?
Sure. So lifespan is the easiest to explain. Lifespan is how many years you live on this planet, chronologically speaking. And I say chronologically on purpose because we'll also, I'm sure, talk at some point about the difference between chronological age, and biological age. And then health span is a little bit more of a contested definition, at least in the scientific and medical communities, but essentially it is how long you live disease free. So there are many diseases of aging, everything from most forms of cancer to cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, glaucoma, the list goes on. These diseases, the number one cause is aging. And so, unfortunately, in modern day Western society, we're seeing in countries like the United States, health spans are actually declining. So, although people might live longer than they ever have before, historically speaking, our health spans are shorter than they have been. And as a result, you have this divide or this gap between lifespan and health span, which means that people might get sick when they're 60 and then live with that chronic illness for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, which is not the most ideal way to live, obviously.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about remaining disease-free and the diseases of aging. It sounds a little bit like the conversation around longevity is also one around preventative health. Is there a difference between the two topics? Are they similar? Do they coincide in their pursuit?
Yes. So they are very similar. So first, longevity is a form of preventative health or preventative medicine. With that said, not all forms of preventative medicine are necessarily conducive to longevity. There's certain things you can do for the sake of short-term health that is not necessarily going to be good for you in the long term. So this is actually a biological concept known as antagonistic pleiotropy, which is a big word for a simple concept. It is what's good for you in the short term might come back to harm you in the long term. For example, sun exposure. If you get sun exposure today, you're going to increase your vitamin D production. Your body will produce more nitric oxide. It will produce endorphins, which make you feel more happy and excited. At the same time, you're causing DNA damage and mutations, which can then lead to melanoma in the future. So that would be an example of something that's good for you today, but not good for you in the long term. And longevity perspective is one that considers this, what is good for you both in the short term and in the long term.
How do you help people get through that shift in perspective to start to pursue things that might be a little bit longer lasting?
A lot of aspects of longevity actually do give you short-term benefits. So it's important to understand that there are biological causes of aging, and we can go into those if you'd like. But when you address these biological causes of aging, you're actually improving your biology here and now in the present. And it's also then going to lead to better health outcomes in the long term. So, for example, the things that I do for my health, I find myself being more energized, more lucid and aware of things. My cognition is better than ever. My sleep is better than ever. And this is relative to my entire lifespan. I feel better today at nearly 40 years old than I did in my teens and in my 20s and early 30s. It's not something that is a quick fix in the sense that you can just take a magic pill and suddenly live forever and feel amazing, though there are supplements, and we can talk about Novos and the benefits that brings. But it's a more long-term approach, and you'll start seeing these improvements over the course of days, weeks, months, and years.
So let's talk a little bit about longevity as a discipline. What are some of the components to understanding longevity?
So there are 10 known causes of aging. For example, stem cell exhaustion. Stem cells are what produce new healthy cells. And as you get older, you have fewer stem cells, or they're just less effective at creating exact replicas of cells. Mitochondrial dysfunction. So these are the power plants of your cells, and they are converting carbohydrates and fats and proteins into energy for your cells to be able to utilize and then essentially function properly. But then there are some less well-known causes of aging. For example, something known as cellular senescence. This is essentially when your cells turn into zombie-like state. And when they're in a zombie-like state, they secrete inflammatory molecules that can then cause neighboring cells to also become senescent or zombie-like. And when you're young, there's very few of these cells, but as you get older, it increases exponentially. And it can lead to things like skin wrinkling or hardening of the arteries and so on. Others are loss of proteostasis, altered intercellular communication, genomic instability, epigenetic alterations. That's a really important one, the epigenome, which we can talk about, telomere shortening, deregulated nutrient sensing, and I mentioned earlier, cross-linking.
Sounds like there's a number of ways that our bodies are starting to work against that clock. Which ones to you are the most readily actionable for people?
Good question. So all of them in one way or another are readily actionable. For example, mitochondrial health is largely influenced by not only your diet, but your activity. If you are exercising a lot, you're going to increase the strain on your body, and your body is going to adapt by increasing its mitochondria. Think about if you go out for a long run and you're feeling exhausted, your body is saying, I need more energy. I need a more efficient use of my energy. And so your mitochondria will become more resilient, and you'll also produce more mitochondria. Being physically active is one of the best ways that you can increase mitochondria. A second way to do it is actually through supplementation. So there are different supplements that can, first of all, fuel the mitochondria, give them what they need to thrive. But also, counterintuitively at first, it can actually put a little bit of stress on the mitochondria, and then those mitochondria come back stronger. So the concept is known in biology as mitohormesis. Mitohormesis is essentially mito for mitochondria, and then hormesis is the idea of putting a stress on something and then that thing coming back stronger as a result of the stress. Exercise is a great case in point example of it. If you can only lift 50 pounds today, but you do it for 5 reps, maybe next week you can come back and do it for 6 reps, or you can lift 55 pounds for 5 reps. That is a case in point example of hormesis, where the body is coming back stronger. You can do the same in a supplementation sense for your mitochondria and have your mitochondria come back stronger.
And in terms of the other hallmarks, are there nutrition practices that people can employ? Are there some things that people can look at outside of just movement that can help enhance some of those other hallmarks?
Sure. So I would say when it comes to lifestyle, if we just oversimplify things and just have 5 buckets, those 5 buckets would be 1, diet, 2, activity, 3, supplementation, 4 is sleep and recovery, and 5 is psychology. So when it comes to diet, there's a lot of controversy for diets, right? But when you look at the research, the longest lived people are following Mediterranean style diets. There's this concept known as blue zones. These are 5 territories across the world where you have the most centenarians. And there are a lot of commonalities across their diet and their lifestyles. And this has been replicated in animal studies as well, in human studies. So when it comes to diet, having a diet that is firmly based in plants, legumes, mushrooms, that being the foundation of the diet is very helpful from the perspective of longevity and overall mechanisms of aging. Minimizing dairy, specifically milk. Milk contains different compounds that can accelerate aging. For example, it can stimulate IGF, insulin-like growth factor. It also contains a molecule known as galactose. And galactose is actually used in scientific studies to induce aging. So it actually accelerates aging in mouse studies, for example, and it's naturally present in milk. Milk can also stimulate what's known as mTOR. mTOR is a biological pathway that is triggered for growth, right? Proliferation of cells and growth. But we're in a constantly fed state and we're constantly triggering this, and this can lead to shorter lifespans. Study after study demonstrates when you're turning on mTOR all of the time, lifespans are shorter. Now, when it comes to milk, having something fermented or having a cheese, you're actually reducing these by a significant margin. And a lot of people in the blue zones do consume some cheese. So it's okay to have some yogurt or cheese, but I personally avoid it altogether and I stick with the non-dairy substitutes. When it comes to red meat and animal proteins, you want to try to minimize that as well. It doesn't mean you need to get rid of it completely, but I personally only have red meat once every couple of months, probably. I'll have chicken more regularly than that. And then have as much fish, healthy fish, fatty fish like salmon and so on as possible. Add as many herbs and spices into your diet as possible. Teas are very common in blue zones for a number of reasons. They can improve health, and moderate your protein. Counterintuitively, for a lot of people going to the gym and in the Equinox community, thinking of having as much protein as possible to build muscle mass, there's actually a balance. Protein will stimulate mTOR, as I mentioned earlier. And so you don't want to overdo it, but you also don't want to underdo it. So the recommendation is, roughly speaking, about 0.5 gram to 0.75 grams per pound of body weight, being at the higher end of that range if you exercise a lot, or if you're older. When you're older, you're more likely to have sarcopenia, where you lose muscle, and falling is a common cause of death for seniors. So you need a little bit more protein when you're older than you would need if you're sedentary and you're young. So activity, 20 minutes per day of brisk walking is the minimum requirement to get, say, 50-60% of the longevity benefits. So you don't need to go crazy with it. But it follows what's known as Pareto's principle, or the 80-20 rule. If you do 20% of the effort, being the 20 or so minutes per day, you're not going to get quite 80%, but you'll get up there, maybe 60-70% of the benefits. If you want to get closer to 100% of the benefits, like myself, then throw in some longer form cardio or high intensity interval training for 2 days a week or so, maybe 3, and incorporate weightlifting as well. A minimum of 2 days a week, up to maybe 4 or 5 days a week. So next, I would say, is sleep and recovery. And so to that point, you don't want to overdo it. I spent most of my teens and 20s overdoing it and pushing my body too far. And I didn't have enough of an appreciation for what rest and recovery would do for my performance, for my overall health, and for my mood and ability to sleep well, and so on. If you're going to sleep, quote unquote, tired and wired, you're feeling energized with a lot of thoughts in your mind, and yet you want to fall asleep, you might be running too much cortisol. You might be overtraining, and overtraining will have a negative impact on your long-term health as well as your performance in the short term. Supplementation. There's 2 concepts that we like to focus on at Novos. So one concept is general health supplements, and the other is longevity health supplements. So for general health, these are the things that the government has set RDAs for. This is your B vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin A, so on and so forth. It's your minerals as well: potassium, zinc, copper, sodium. And then your longevity supplements are what we specialize in specifically at Novos, which is formulations that have been shown to have a positive impact on these 10 hallmarks of aging and are able to slow down the aging process, as demonstrated across many different animal studies, across different human studies as well. It's harder to definitively prove lifespan extension in humans because we live so long, and the studies would be prohibitively expensive. But we can see if we're extending lifespan in animal studies, and then turn back to humans and see if we're improving health outcomes in humans that are correlated to these extended lifespans in the animals, and then have a pretty solid basis to conclude that it is going to improve health span and lifespan for humans. And then finally, psychology. So simple things. Having 3 solid friendships has actually been shown in studies to improve health span and lifespan by a very significant margin. So, positive, loving relationships, having 3 of them is like that critical number. Having purpose in life goes a very long way. Conscientiousness, people who are conscientious live longer lives. And reducing your stress as much as possible, whether that be through meditation or prayer or being in green spaces, out in nature. These are all critical components.
You talked a little bit about protein intake. For us, as a fitness company, people come to our clubs, they're working out. Protein is definitely a priority for many people looking to build muscle. Where does the individual nature of the recommendation come in? You mentioned the blue zones. Many people in those blue zones are of much smaller stature. Me at 6'4" probably has a much different requirement than somebody who is in one of those zones. So how does that start to play in to some of the recommendations? Is it just a blanket one size fits all, or is there a more nuanced approach?
So my philosophy has gone from one where it was all about having high protein diet, as I did in my teens and 20s, to what is the minimum dose of protein I need to be able to accomplish my goals. So it's flipped upside down. What I would say is that studies have found that people who are weightlifting and getting into peak shape, they typically don't need much more than 0.75 grams per pound of body weight. And the 0.5 grams might be closer to someone who is in the blue zone, right? So that would be getting, in that case, 50% more protein than a blue zone person would be. So that's a pretty significant margin. Now, if you have a different goal, like becoming Mr. Olympia has a whole other set of requirements and needs, and they're probably not focused on longevity. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking the substances that they are to achieve that goal. So context is important. If you want to live the balanced life where it's about living as long, as healthy as possible, you're going to take that perspective of what's the minimum dose I need, to be able to still reach or maintain my fitness goals. And I think around 0.75 is that magic number.
When it comes to a more individualized approach, are there ways that we can start to test and understand where we might fall in a longevity spectrum? Is there blood work that we can do with our doctor? Are there other tests that we can start looking into to get an idea of where we currently stand?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So when it comes to blood work, it's what we've been doing for years. You go to the doctor, they order a blood panel, they tell you what your cholesterol is, what your blood sugar is, and so on. And essentially what they're looking for is deficiencies or excesses, certain signals that maybe your liver isn't functioning properly, and so on. And it's somewhat of a crude way to go about things to see if they need to dig in further for the possibility of diagnosing some sort of illness, or it could actually just be indicative of a potential long-term issue. So if you're getting blood work done from a longevity perspective, certain biomarkers like HbA1c to see what your blood glucose is. And ideally, you get that as low as possible at around 5 or lower. And if you're getting in the upper 5s or above, then you're either pre-diabetic or becoming diabetic. And high blood sugar can accelerate aging primarily through the cross-linking that I mentioned earlier, but then that can have cascading effects across all of the other hallmarks of aging as well. Another is inflammatory markers like HSCRP or the interleukins, seeing that you have excess inflammation and then it's chronic. That could also be a signal that in the long term something is going to go wrong. So let's figure out why do you have high inflammatory markers, and let's try to remedy that or fix it for the sake of your long-term health. And then iron is actually an important one. So if your iron is too low, we all know that that can cause fatigue and memory issues and so on. So you don't want to be too low on the iron, but there's actually studies that show that there's a direct correlation with cancer and having higher levels of iron. So you want your iron levels to be as low as possible within the healthy range and without taking away from your quality of life, of course. So I would say those are some of the blood markers. But what's even more exciting than these, in my estimation, is what's known as epigenetic tests. I mentioned earlier, one of the hallmarks of aging is epigenetic alterations. So your epigenome sits above your genome. So you have your genes, everyone's familiar with those. Those are like the piano keys. Your epigenome is like the player of that piano. And depending on your health status and your age, that player can be playing Tchaikovsky, or it can be like a kid just crashing down on the keys and playing, chaotic sounds. And so ideally, it sounds as much like a symphony as possible, so to speak. And as you age, there are certain genes that are turned on that shouldn't be turned on, and there are certain genes that are turned off that shouldn't be turned off. And what scientists have come up with are these clocks where they're able to see these correlations across people of different age and health statuses. And they're able to say that you are biologically a certain age. So for example, you might be chronologically 40, but then biologically 42 or 48 or 37. And what does this ultimately mean? It is how old your body's biology is, which is essentially how old you actually are from a illness and mortality perspective. For example, somebody who is 50 has a much higher risk of mortality than somebody who's 30. Everyone knows that. And so maintaining as low of a biological age as possible is the best predictor for health complications, chronic illness, and mortality. And so these are the most exciting tests. There is one known as the Dunedin Pace Clock, which in our estimation, consulting with dozens of scientists in the field, is the most accurate clock out there right now. This clock isn't looking at your biological age specifically, it's looking at your pace of aging, the rate at which you're aging per chronological year. And so ideally, you want that to be as low as possible. Mine personally is 0.69, which is an outlier. The lab that ran these tests for us said that my results were among the best that they have ever seen. And so that basically means that for every one chronological year at this current point in time, I'm aging 0.69 years, which means I'm aging slower than the average person is, which then leads to me having better health for the long term, assuming nothing suddenly goes wrong, but also just biologically feeling better, having more energy, feeling more like I'm in my 20s than feeling like I'm in nearly 40 years old.
It's interesting that you mentioned the clock because I've also done the same assessment and mine was a 0.81. So a little bit higher than yours, but still less.
Fantastic. That's a
So
fantastic score.
what I'd like to just discuss here is what led to your low number, right? Because anytime you're going to start to go down a certain path and do something, there's opportunity costs, right? The things that you're giving up in order to achieve this higher health span, right? So, what are some of the things that you do to get yourself down to that number?
Yeah, I raised the point before about conscientious people being shown statistically to live significantly longer lifespans. And so I would say I'm a pretty conscientious person in the sense of setting goals, being long-term focused, being very self-aware. And on a weekly basis, I have a routine when it comes to my diet, my bedtime, my exercise. There's a routine. It doesn't mean I don't fluctuate from the routine. When there are opportunities to do so, I do. And on the weekends, I fluctuate more. I'll, have my cheat meals, so to speak, or I might have some alcohol every so often, though I do drink a lot less in Florida where I'm living now than when I lived in New York. But I have this regimented routine is the key takeaway. Each day I have similar wake up time. I go outside, I get bright sunlight in my eyes. I start a jog or a brisk walk. I go to the gym, I work out in the morning, and then I have my coffee. I fast. I do typically about 6 hours of eating and 18 hours where I'm not eating throughout the day. So that basically means around 1 or 2 p.m., I'll have my first meal. And then around 7 or 8 p.m., I'll finish eating for the whole day. And then those meals are, as I mentioned earlier about diet, being very plant-based, mushrooms, vegetables, legumes, and so on, with typically fatty fish or eggs with egg yolk, which has really healthy compounds like choline in it, which are great for your methylation, which methylation is essentially how your epigenome functions. And it's also great for neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, which are great for muscle function and thinking. When it comes to the very popular topic, alcohol, what types of sacrifices do you need to make to get to this level? It's a very controversial topic. There are scientists that have run studies that have essentially said, and the press has loved to pick up on this story, that drinking alcohol is actually good for you and can extend lifespan or extend health span, reduce the risk of heart attacks. Unfortunately, there is a study done this year which has shown that's actually not the case. It's a study that looked at all of these studies and then used more advanced statistical modeling and found that no matter what dose of alcohol you drink, even if it's just a half a glass, you are increasing the chances of mortality and cardiovascular complications. So what does that ultimately mean from a longevity perspective? I mean, you need to live life, you need to enjoy life. So it's not to say that you need to stop drinking completely. It just means that alcohol is literally a poison. It is causing damage to your cells. It destroys cells, but it doesn't mean you can't have it. If you look at the blue zones, for example, Sardinia, Italy is one of them. The people who are living in the mountains, they're living 90, 100, 110 years. They are consuming wine. They are drinking practically every day with their dinner. So it doesn't mean you can't drink. It just means the dose makes the poison. And keep in mind that there might be a cost to having it, but it might be a cost that you're willing to take on.
Yeah, no, I find it really interesting to hear all the things that you do, and I'm just thinking in my own head about how really everybody is an individual, right? Because we talked about our numbers. Mine are still lower than they should be, not as low as yours, but I have red meat a couple times a week. I probably drink more than you drink. I work out a couple times a day versus, your morning workout. I have coffee first thing when I wake up. So like our behaviors are very different, but the impact on my numbers aren't as bad as maybe they should be. I think for me, like just figuring out how much you're willing to give and take is really the balance that you're going to have to strike for yourself.
Yeah, you make a great point. There's a list of things you can do, and you can pick and choose which ones you're willing to do. I mentioned earlier the Pareto's principle, the 80-20 rule. If you're doing 20% of the things, you're doing more than most people are, and you're going to get pretty far along. Maybe not necessarily 80% of the way, but maybe 50% of the way. And as you do more and more things, it is a larger and larger cost, so to speak, in terms of the restrictions that you might need to institute into your life in order to get closer to that 99 percentile. Being aware of where you are in your life and what it is that you're looking for in your life, and just being aware of what is conducive to an improved lifespan and health span and what is counter to that, then you can figure out where on the spectrum exactly you want to be. And you having 0.81 as your outcome is a fantastic score. I was actually curious, are you taking Novos and getting that score, or?
I take no supplements. Yeah, I would say the red wine and the red meat are my supplements. So
Right,
yeah,
right, right.
no.
Okay. I'd be curious to see if the score changes. We've seen for people, for example, there is a person in his early 70s who, before taking Novos, his epigenetic outcome was -1 year. So essentially, that's within the margin of error. It's accurate. It's basically what his chronological age was. And then he took Novos for 6 months and it came back as -10 years. So it was a dramatic
That's
improvement
pretty
for this
dramatic.
person. Yeah.
I would definitely love to see a before and after if I got started there. But you just mentioned the individual who was 70 and lowered their score. I feel like when people talk about longevity, there is a perception that it's something that older people are doing to become younger or to feel younger. How does somebody who's already young start to wrap their head around this concept? How should they feel? If they aren't feeling major differences, are there ways that they can track those differences so they know that there's a positive benefit?
Yeah. So, first of all, doing it younger, as I mentioned earlier, is the best time to do it, because when you fast forward 10 years, 15 years, and you look at your peers might be getting sick, unfortunately, they might be looking older than they actually are. And you're going to be in a great place because you made this investment in your future. Just like taking some of your paycheck and investing, and 10 years later waking up with some, like a nest egg saved. It's a very similar concept of investing in your health. In terms of being able to track it, there are different bio trackers you can use. For example, I have the Aura Ring. A lot of people have the Whoop wristband. And there are certain metrics that are better to look at than others when it comes to making sure that you are improving the rest and recovery aspect of what I mentioned before for a longevity lifestyle. So that would be your HRV, or heart rate variability, which is a indicator of your stress levels. These stress levels can be influenced both by psychological stress and physiological stress. So if you're overtraining, your HRV is going to be lower. If you are very stressed because of a stressful event in your life, your HRV is going to be lower. The second one I would say is your sleep, the sleep efficiency and how much time you are spending in the different phases of sleep and the total amount of time sleeping. I would say also your resting heart rate. If that's elevated, that's indicative of being overstressed as well. Not as accurate as HRV, but nonetheless something worth looking at. And then you can also get an at-home scale. The brand Withings makes one. I have it. I had to import it from Europe because the American version doesn't have this metric, but it's something called pulse wave velocity. And pulse wave velocity is something used in scientific studies to measure the firmness of your arteries and blood vessels. Ideally, they aren't firm. You want them to be very elastic, like a rubber band. And so the faster your pulse wave velocity, the worse it is for your health, which is counterintuitive to some. But when you think about sending a wave through something, if it's firm, it vibrates very quickly. If it's something that's elastic, it moves slowly like a wave in an ocean. And having that as low as possible is a great biomarker for your heart health, for your cardiovascular function, which is, by the way, the number one killer of seniors is cardiovascular disease.
You talk about cardiovascular disease, and I think from our perspective, training the cardiometabolic system is something that we prioritize throughout the organization. You talk about different metrics to collect. I know we've talked about the epigenetic testing, the blood biomarkers. Are there physical tests that people can do? So things like testing your VO2 and understanding that metric, grip strength, overall muscle strength. Are these valid metrics for longevity as well?
They are, yeah. So grip strength is something commonly applied in scientific studies for longevity. And when you get older, your grip strength declines significantly. And when you have a disease or you're close to death, it will also decrease significantly. You just have to be careful in terms of the time of day when you're doing it, and also be mindful of your recovery. If you're overtraining or not sleeping enough, your grip strength is going to be worse than it would otherwise be. But if you collect enough data points, enough samples, you do it often enough, you can track that, certainly. VO2 max is another fantastic one. I track that myself as well. There is a study done in another blue zone, which is in Greece, and they looked at the VO2 max of normal Westerners and then these people. And they were actually pretty similar for people in their 30s and 40s. But once they hit 50 and on, the VO2 max was significantly higher for the people in the blue zone than for the rest of us. And that then also correlated with much longer health spans and lifespans. So VO2 max is a good indicator. It is more applicable as you reach later decades in your life, but nonetheless, it is something that is fantastic. If you have a high VO2 max when you're younger, you're more likely to maintain that when you're older or be able to achieve it again when you're older. Yes, I would look at that as well.
So you mentioned before about the individual maybe trying to become Mr. Olympia, right? And that's a little bit more of a nuanced type of goal. How do things that are a little bit more performance oriented, like running a marathon, play into longevity, right? Because a lot of research will show that the impact of running a marathon, especially running multiple marathons, could be detrimental to your health in the short term. Is there long-term implications for that as well? How does that kind of play into a more long-term strategy?
Yeah, so that takes us back to the concept I mentioned before of hormesis. And so putting the hormesis is all about the dose. The dose makes the poison not just for alcohol, but also for exercise, physical activity, and so on. When you're running marathons, you are going beyond that hormetic dose and you're putting on a lot more stress to your body. And I don't mean simply in the terms of on your knees and joints and ligaments and so on. Even on a cellular level, you're overwhelming your body and there can be DNA damage that results from it. And your body has mechanisms, it has tools and proteins known as sirtuins, for example, that can repair the DNA. But if you're overwhelming your body like that regularly, it's probably also going to have long-term consequences as well. The first marathoner died of a heart attack, and I don't mean to dissuade fitness enthusiasts. I am one of them, but I personally have never gone as far as running marathons for that reason. I didn't want to push it too hard. I'll run half marathons every so often, and that's already pushing myself. But if you are going to run marathons, just realize, just like drinking alcohol, there's a price to it. But if you're in very good shape and you ease into it and you don't push yourself too hard, too fast, you treat recovery as being of utmost importance, and you have an anti-inflammatory diet, as I described earlier, maybe there's certain supplements that will also help with this, then you can minimize that damage. And to your question about long-term implications, it will have less of a long-term implication than if you weren't otherwise thinking from this perspective.
So it's kind of more of an acute dose versus a chronic dose, and thinking about the time in between those acute bouts of activity, really maximizing your ability to recover from those before you get into the next event.
Yeah, that's definitely something that would help to minimize the damage.
I'm sure a lot of people come to you wanting to get started, pursuing a little bit more of a longevity lifestyle. So, what are some of the challenges that people face getting started, and how do you talk to them about that?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just confusion, feeling overwhelmed. There's so much health advice out there, and people are saying, eat red meat, don't eat red meat, have wine, don't have wine, have milk, don't have milk, right? Eggs are bad for you or they're good for you. And so people are confused, and there's all different perspectives on health. Part of my health journey was experimenting with different diets like keto or paleo or Mediterranean and so on, different supplements, more than 100 of them I experimented with over the course of years. What I eventually came to was the understanding of that concept that I mentioned earlier, antagonistic pleiotropy. That took me a long way to really comprehend that a lot of the things that are being recommended to people are actually based on different goals than longevity. So, for example, if your goal is to, as I mentioned earlier, become Mr. Olympia, you're going to have a very different diet and supplementation and lifestyle routine than I would. And so, first is if you have decided that yes, longevity is what you want to focus on and you can still achieve great things athletically and you're not putting a limit on yourself there, then you need to know who to trust and who to turn to for that. There are some great people in the space, everyone from Dr. David Sinclair at Harvard, who wrote the book Lifespan. It's a New York Times bestseller. Dr. Peter Attia, he has a great podcast. Dr. George Church at Harvard and MIT, he's one of our scientific advisory board members at Novos. Dr. Pedro Malgajes is also one of our scientific advisory board members, TED speaker, a leader in the longevity field. Dr. Walter Longo, when it comes to diet and caloric restriction and fasting, he's based out in California. And then Novos, as a company, we are a public benefit corporation. And as part of that mission to do good for the public, we publish a lot of information about longevity, research based articles. Every article has cited research in it written by medical doctors and PhDs about what is the best things for you to improve your longevity. So starting there at the Novos blog and learning about the hallmarks of aging, learning about things you can do to slow down aging. We have quick tips to improve your sleep or quick tips to improve your longevity. That's a good place to get started. And then following that, subscribing to our newsletter, we have an ebook that you can download for free that goes into all of this. I think that that's a really good place to really start to comprehend it. And I'm telling you, if you read that ebook, you will know more than your doctor about what causes aging. I guarantee it.
When we talk about the biological implications of some of this stuff, are there differences in the approach for men and women, different genders, or is it a unified, all the hallmarks affect everybody the same way?
Yeah, so there isn't as much research as would be ideal on the differences between males and females when it comes to the longevity implications. And we do know, for example, that women live longer lifespans than males. There's a lot of controversy as to why that's the case. For example, one argument is that males have more androgenic hormones like testosterone, which can accelerate aging. And that's one potential explanation. Another is men have higher iron levels. I mentioned earlier that can increase the incidence of cancer. Women lose blood every month when they're pre-menopausal. And so as a result, they have less incidence from that. We know the difference between lifespans between males and females in terms of what is going to be best for a male or a female. The hallmarks, the mechanisms affect males and females both. And there are definitely differences, but I don't think we're far enough along in the research to be able to prescribe a different lifestyle to somebody because they're male or because they're female.
Just to wrap up, kind of future facing, what excites you about the future of the longevity space?
So Novos is a consumer biotech company, essentially. So we create formulations with world-renowned scientists in the longevity field who are doing cutting-edge biotech research. And then our mission is to essentially take these innovations and discoveries in the scientific laboratory for biotechs and bring it home to consumers in a very safe, maintainable way so that we can access these innovations here and now. And so I'm very excited, first of all, just for how the field is evolving and what this is going to mean for us as a company in terms of what we can deliver to you, the consumer, and me as well, because I take all of my own medicine. More generally speaking, in the longevity field, I'm really excited about epigenetics, the epigenome. The epigenome, as I mentioned before, is which genes are turned on and off. And there was a researcher in Japan who won the Nobel Prize for something that's known as the Yamanaka factors. These are enzymes that are able to modify cells and make them young again. Essentially, taking an older cell, it can actually reverse its age back to a stem cell state. And this has now been applied. A researcher who we're in talks with, his name is Professor Ocampo, he's in Switzerland. He was able to, in a seminal study, apply these Yamanaka factors to mice and actually reduce the biological age of these mice. And when they did an autopsy of different organs like the liver, they were able to show that the liver of these mice went back to its youthful state again. Other researchers like Dr. David Sinclair has a project under his oversight that is looking at applying these Yamanaka factors and this epigenetic technology to do things like cure blindness. And so eventually what many people in the field see is that we will be able to reprogram the epigenome such that it's younger. And so if your genes are in that younger state, then you're going to have a younger physiology, so to speak, and you can essentially turn back the clock. Now, that doesn't mean that the other 9 hallmarks of aging are thrown out the window. Those are all also still important. But in terms of some of the more exciting, aggressive approaches to the aging process, I'm really excited about the epigenetic research.
So we're not too far away from being able to live forever, is what you're saying.
So what you're talking about is what's known as longevity escape velocity. And so what that means essentially is that if we can extend lifespan by 1 year or more per chronological year, even if we haven't cured aging, but we're just extending it every year, then we reach escape velocity where you could in theory live forever unless something like being hit by a car happens.
And here in New York City, that's an ever-present danger. So
That is true. Yes.
listen, Chris, I want to thank you for your time today. This was a great discussion. You dove into a lot of topics that I know are going to be really relevant for our members. I feel like this could have gone on for another hour. But again, just thank you for your time, your expertise, your journey, and for sharing all that with us.
Of course.
How can people find out more about Novos?
If you go to novoslabs.com, you can learn more about our products as well as our blog, which has a tremendous amount of content. We're also Novos Labs on all of the social channels. And then I have a personal blog, slowmyage.com, where I write about my biological age results. We didn't get a chance to go into it, but like my telomere age is that of a 7.8-year-old. My biological age is more than 1/3 younger than my chronological age. And then all of these other biological markers like VO2 max and pulse wave velocity and so on. I blog about those and then about my personal lifestyle, what I do on a daily basis, so that people can iterate on it and experiment for themselves. That's slowmyage.com, and also on Instagram as slowmyage, and Twitter as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that. I'm in need of some updated strategies. One of our core values at Equinox is to challenge the status quo. We want to bring you content that is at the cutting edge of health and wellness, including this interview. The views expressed are those of the interviewee and are not endorsed by nor reflect the views of Equinox. This interview is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions and before making any decisions on these thought-provoking topics.